Chapter 4 Macquarie Island. For the journey south to Macquarie Island, a second ship, the Toroa, had been purchased to help carry some of the men and extra supplies, including live sheep and even some cats. Even with two ships, it was impossible to fit everything into the storage holds, so the decks were piled high with hut timbers, wireless masts, and box upon box of supplies. Due to the lack of space, even the sled dogs had to be kept on deck, and during periods of bad weather or high seas, they were lashed to the decking. During such times, they were frequently soaked by the waves coming over the sides of the ship, and they howled miserably throughout. Conditions for the men weren't much better, and, on the Aurora, the seas meant that cooking was nearly impossible much of the time. Captain Davis remarked that this wasn't necessarily a bad thing, as the cook on board was terrible. During one storm, a wave tore the motorboat from its moorings and it rolled around the deck dangerously until Frank Wild and a small group of other men risked their lives to hold it with ropes while another group successfully secured it to the deck again. As opposed to the confident, capable John King Davis, the Toroa was captained by a man known as Roaring Tom. Tom never trusted the navigation of anyone on his crew and insisted he did it himself, but with very mixed results. One night, he confided with the explorers on board that his calculations suggested that they weren't south of Australia, but were in fact in the middle of India. Later, he loudly proclaimed that they would reach Macquarie Island at sundown the following day, and it is said that as soon as he finished the sentence, the lookout spotted land. Macquarie Island is around 40 kilometres long and 8 kilometres wide. Hilly and shrouded in fog, it was home to a large number of birds, from king penguins to giant petrels and weka, as well as leopard seals and elephant seals. The island was supposed to be uninhabited by humans, so it was with some surprise when the explorers saw a small group of men come down to the shore to greet them. These men were shipwrecked sailors who'd been able to survive on the local wildlife while hoping to get the attention of a passing ship. Most of these men headed back to Australia on board the Toroa. One stayed with the Aurora and headed to Antarctica, however, as a replacement for the Aurora's hapless cook. Prior to leaving Sydney, all of the huts had been assembled. Then, all of the boards, frames and timbers had been numbered before the structure had been disassembled. So upon arrival at Macquarie Island, the expedition members were quickly able to put together the hut that would be the new home for the 5 scientists who would stay on the island. Their mission was to survey the island and the species that lived there, as well as to operate the wireless communication system that would provide weather reports to Australia and allow Mawson to keep in contact with the Australian mainland. It was during the time on the island that the Antarctic explorers began to bond and begin to feel that they were part of something together. In the evenings they would sit and chat or sing songs. And all of the men helped build the wireless station, and so just a week later it was complete. Waving farewell to those remaining on the island and those returning to Australia on the Toroa, the Aurora sailed south. It was the 23rd of December, 1911. Chapter 5 Adelie Land. 3 days into the journey south from Macquarie Island, the party saw their first iceberg. There were seabirds flying overhead, and the ice itself was dotted with seals, sea lions and penguins. The sight of them drove the dogs crazy, and Dr. Mertz, the Swiss skier and expedition dog wrangler, high up in the crow's nest, joined them with his own warbled yodeling. On January 8, 1912, land was spotted, a thin white line that rose above the ice pack that transformed into hills and steep cliffs as they sailed closer. They had made it to Adelie Land, which was the area chosen for the site of the main base. This would have been a wondrous sight for all on board, especially for all those who had never even seen snow before. Captain Davis navigated them close to where there was a sloping section that would be easily accessible for men to approach in one of Aurora's whaleboats. Mawson, the photographer Frank Hurley and a few others ventured out and struck for land. It was an unwritten rule that Mawson, as expedition leader, would be the first one to step onto what was now known as Cape Denison. But the others in the rowboat were all eager to be able to say that they were the second person to set foot in the place. However, in his haste, Hurley tripped and fell over as he exited the boat. The others, in good humour, congratulated him on being the first person to sit on Adelie land. The shore party did a quick survey of the area and determined that it would be perfect for the main base. The gentle gradient would be an excellent spot for the hut, as well as be easy to navigate for sledging parties. The equipment and men of the main base were ferried from the Aurora to Cape Denison by whaleboat and motorboat, the same motorboat that Frank Wild and others had saved during the storms on the way to Macquarie Island. On one trip, when a crate was being manoeuvred off a whaleboat, it slipped and fell into the water and sank. Even though the water was quite shallow, it was near freezing cold, so its loss was considered acceptable, and they proceeded to unload the rest of the provisions. However, once the party had started constructing their hut, they noticed the stove was missing. Survival during an Antarctic winter depended on the stove, so their efforts to find it were redoubled, until someone remembered the crate at the bottom of the ocean. Attempts were made to hook it up, but these all failed. In the end, Douglas Mawson stripped down and jumped into the freezing Antarctic waters. He hauled up the crate before rushing into the half-assembled hut to warm up. When the lid of the crate was prized off, it was discovered to contain jars of jam. The missing stove part was found safe and sound elsewhere within the stores, but it was some time later that anyone admitted this mistake to Mawson. On the 19th of January 1912, and 10 days after the Aurora had arrived in Cape Denison, the ship weighed anchor and headed west, taking Frank Wild and the rest of the Western Base party to find their own suitable spot for their hut. Frank Wild had a bad feeling as he left the main base, saying in a letter home, quote, "I could not help thinking that our goodbyes were to some of them forever. It is a fearful country where they are landed." Chapter 6. The Home of the Blizzard. Mawson and his team completed the hut and had their first night in it on January 26, 1912. The night was marked with heavy snow, and the first sign that perhaps they'd been extremely fortunate with the weather so far. For from that day on, the temperature dropped and the winds blew stronger and stronger. For much of the time in those early days, the men would work hard at repairing wind and snow-damaged parts of the huts and plugging all the gaps with newspaper. The hut itself was a very small space, considering it was to be home for 18 men for a year. Around 3 walls were bunk beds that most of the men slept in. Mawson, as expedition leader, had a couple of thin walls separating his sleeping area from the main room. In the middle of the hut was a long dining table and chairs, and the fourth wall had the stove and kitchen area, with a small area that could be curtained off for Hurley to develop photographs. Off the main room were 2 smaller workspaces for the mechanics and scientists to work in, and off the smaller of these was the latrine. The workshop was an extremely small space. Lazaron remarked, quote, "If the desire had come to swing the proverbial cat, it would have been very hard on the cat." Around the whole hut was a second wall with a corridor in between. This corridor separated the main living area from the outside elements and provided some insulation. It was here that the base had its cold food storage, and also where the dogs lived. As the inhabitants expected that the snow would pile up outside the walls during winter, the only windows in the hut were in the ceiling. The snow would also provide further insulation from the cold and the wind. The hut, though, was not warm, even with the insulation in the stove. It was kept at around 5 degrees Celsius. On the coldest nights, a thin sheen of ice would form on the men as they slept, and they often found their mattresses would freeze to the walls. And as cold as the hut was, it was worse in the corridor where the dogs slept. On many occasions, the dogs would freeze to the floor and have to be chipped free with an ice axe. On days with bad weather, which became increasingly common as summer turned to autumn, most of the expedition were kept inside all day, but there was always plenty for them to do. Mertz and Ninnis would spend time preparing the dogs' food, which was made up of seal meat and blubber, as much as was possible from hunting expeditions. In the workroom, biological specimens would be assessed and pickled. Wind-damaged equipment would be repaired. Blood tests and bacterial cultures were collected and analysed. Outside of mealtimes, Lazaron, the fledgling taxidermist, would convert the dining table into a workbench and spend the days skinning seals and penguins. Hurley, the photographer, would also double as a general handyman at such times, so he was busy mending clothes or sewing up tents or sledging harnesses. However, even on the most miserable days, Webb, the magnetician, would have to venture out of the comfort and safety of the hut to attend to his magnetic instruments which were housed nearly a kilometre away. Others who had to venture out the hut every day were the meteorologist Madigan and his assistant Hodgman. Like Webb, they had to travel across several hundred metres of unsheltered ice to reach the rocks their equipment was on. All three men had to learn how to move safely but quickly in high winds. They all mastered the art of leaning far forward and could even walk into 100 km/h winds. On days when there wasn't a blizzard, the men would gladly pile out of the hut to gather food, specimens, and data. Mawson was keen for everyone to remain busy and occupied every day to ensure that lethargy and despondency didn't set in. He also recognised the importance of routine, so there was a set schedule for the day with a roster of tasks. One man was assigned as being the night watchman. His main duty was to keep the stove going, but he also took meteorological readings and ensured there was always ice melting in pots to provide them with fresh water. Come morning, the night watchman would wake the two men assigned to be the cook and the cook's assistant, and while these two men began preparing breakfast for the group, the night watchman would retreat to bed to get some sleep. Breakfast was ready at 8 a.m. and the day would begin in earnest. After breakfast, the cook's assistant would clean and tidy everything away, making space in the main room for the scientists who needed the table for their activities. Lunch would then be served at 1 p.m. and dinner at 6:30 p.m. Dinner tended to have a set meat for each night, perhaps to help the men keep track of the passage of time. On Mondays and Thursdays, the meat was penguin, seal on Tuesdays and Fridays, canned meat on Wednesday, mutton on Sunday, and it was chef's choice on Saturdays. Unlike breakfast, which was often quite simple food and taken quickly, a lot of time and effort went into the evening meal, both in terms of the preparation and the meal itself. Hurley prided himself on the elaborate presentation of his meals, with many dishes representing scenes of their time in Antarctica. However, not all of the expedition members were adept in the kitchen. On one occasion, the young dog handler Ninnis served up a meal of salmon kedgeree that was, by all accounts, awful. When confronted on what he had made, he proclaimed that he had followed the recipe exactly. On closer inspection, the recipe said to add, quote, 3 ounces of breadcrumbs, cayenne pepper, and salt. And Ninnis has added 3 ounces, but not just the breadcrumbs, but the cayenne pepper and salt as well. While most of the party refused to eat it, a couple of the men took it on as a challenge. Their successful efforts were met with cheers and much merriment. The group took every opportunity to turn meals into elaborate celebrations. On one occasion, the anniversary of the lighting of London with gas was commemorated with tremendous enthusiasm. Dr. Xavier Mertz hosted Swiss Confederation Day and cooked exotic Swiss dishes. Every expedition member's birthday was also a cause of celebration, song, and cheer. The birthday dinner for Mertz was followed by a concert, with everyone participating, including Stilwell, the geologist, playing the organ. The curtained-off area that Hurley used as a photography darkroom doubled as a lair for concealed surprises. from the cook bursting out with some sort of culinary treat, through to it being a changing room for the actors of, quote, the IT Society for the Prevention of the Blues, who would put on plays or skits after the main meal had concluded. One night, an unrehearsed play called The Washerwoman's Secret was performed. The play was about a young woman, played by the medical officer McLean, who had 4 suitors competing for her affections. After the evening's revelry, the cook's assistant would clean everything away and everyone would make their way to bed, all except the next night watchman. In addition to his set duties, the night watchman often took advantage of the quiet and empty space to have a bath. Bathing was a luxury in the hut, especially since water was such a valuable commodity. Collecting ice was hard work, and it took heat and fuel to melt it. So the men would, on average, only bathe once every 18 days. The routine continued through the long, cold winter months. The snow began to pile up outside the hut, and soon enough it was partially buried as expected. Throughout winter, the wind was a near-permanent presence. What the men soon learned was that they'd built their hut in the windiest known place on Earth. In July, the wind peaked at 190 kilometers per hour, and for one 8-hour period, it maintained an average of 170 kilometers per hour. The men were happy enough though, all having work they could get on with regardless of the weather. During this time, friendships began to form amongst the expedition members. In one corner of the hut were the 4 bunks belonging to Mertz, Ninnis, Bickerton and Madigan. This part of the hut became affectionately known as Hyde Park Corner. The 2 men who had grown closest, perhaps because they'd been together all the way since London, were Ninnis and Mertz. Ninnis had come to see the older Mertz as a mentor figure and wrote of him in his diary, quote, "He is one of the finest, if not the finest fellow I have ever met, and knowing him has done more for me, mentally, morally and physically, than anything else could have." Mertz himself wrote of his happiness of this time in the hut. He wrote, quote, "A lot of people can't understand why we travelled to an unknown land. The danger, laborious work and cold weather wouldn't tempt them. If they could see our satisfaction and enjoy the life with us, they would realise how, in this area, hard work and life difficulties bring delights." The main disappointment during this time was the wireless radio. They had sent many messages, but they weren't sure if any had been successfully delivered as they had not received a single reply. In truth, none of their messages got through to Sawyer, the radio operator stationed at Macquarie Island. All through winter, they were completely cut off from the rest of the world. Chapter 7. Spring. By mid-October, life began to return to Cape Denison. Seals came ashore, as did penguins. Wherever possible, the men would head out in hunting parties, keen to eat some fresh meat after months of eating tinned and preserved food. With the improved weather, the group turned their attention to the second phase of the expedition, the sledging trips. It was expected that several 3-man sledging trips would head out for the summer, collecting scientific data and mapping the uncharted area. In preparation for this, the equivalent of 48 weeks' worth of food was sorted and packed. Food was rationed at around 1 kilogram of food per person per day, in line with what Shackleton had done on his previous expedition. The main ingredient was pemmican, a concentrated mixture of dried meat and lard, along with plasmon biscuits, which were made of flour and milk protein powder. These 2 ingredients would then be mixed together with water and boiled to make hoosh, which could be made to preference, either thick like porridge or thin like soup. The rations were packed in such a way that a week's food for 3 men was stored in an individual bag to make things easier to manage out on the ice. Many of these bags were bright and colourful and had been made by Paquita and her mother before the expedition left Australia, and these bags were affectionately known as paquita bags. As many of the men on the expedition had no sledging experience and no one knew the layout of the surrounding area, a number of small-scale trips were undertaken so the men could test themselves, their equipment, and to lay down supply depots for future trips. However, it quickly became apparent that the weather was still worse than they had planned for, as even after just travelling for 100 kilometres, they returned with damaged equipment and frostbitten extremities. They did what they could to strengthen and improve their equipment, but all were hoping that the weather would improve significantly by the time they were ready to head out in earnest. On one such foray, the trio of Mawson, Madigan and Ninnis came across a cave that was around 1 kilometre away from the hut. It was well sheltered from the wind, and the icy walls sparkled in the torchlight, which was what had prompted them to call it Aladdin's Cave. The cave would become a safe haven for many of the sledging parties on their way out and on their way back to the hut. This was also the first opportunity for the sled dogs to be harnessed up and tested. As neither of the handlers, Ninnis or Mertz, were trained in any way, the results were slow and relied as much on the dogs' breeding and strengths as it did on the men assigned to train them. However, the two men had formed good bonds with the dogs all the way back to their time travelling from London to Australia, and they were both enthusiastic and quick to learn. At the same time, the old body of the crashed plane was hauled out of storage, and the mechanic Bickerton worked to fit the engine to a large tractor sledge. While the tractor was unreliable and frequently broke down, he was able to get it to pull heavy loads of provisions up the steeper slopes to a depot nearly 10 kilometres inland. As summer approached, the men began to feel more confident in their skill as sledgers, and that their equipment could stand up to the ferocious blizzards that could still occur in the area, even as the weather generally improved. After the trial runs and the supply depots were fully stocked, the plan and personnel for each of the main sledging parties was agreed. There were to be 3 main expedition groups. The first party was to be led by the meteorologist Madigan, who, along with the Chief Medical Officer McLean and the instrument maker Carell, was to explore the coast as far to the east as possible before returning back the way they came. The second group, led by the astronomer Bage, included the photographer Hurley and the magnetician Webb. They were to push towards the South Magnetic Pole, taking magnetic and astronomical measurements as they went. Upon reaching the pole, they too would return to the hut the way they had come. The third group was to be led by Mawson himself, along with Ninnis and Mertz. This group, accompanied by all 16 of the sled dogs, was to push inland to the east as far as possible, surveying as they went. The aim was to travel over 560 kilometres and to reach Oates Island, which had been discovered the previous year by Cook's ship, the Terra Nova. By making it this far east, Mawson would therefore link his expedition's maps and discoveries with those from previous explorers. Most of the other men would go out in support groups accompanying the main parties and restocking supply depots, as well as mapping the territory in areas not otherwise covered by the main groups. However, at all times, there would be several men left in the hut to keep the stove going and to keep taking measurements. It was agreed that all parties would aim to return to the hut by the 31st of December where possible, but by the 15th of January at the absolute latest. The dates were not negotiable, and were entirely due to the changing of summer into spring. Captain Davis and the Aurora was scheduled to return to pick them up during January, and any later, and the weather might deteriorate to a point that the Aurora couldn't approach to pick them up. Any delay would also put the lives of the men at the western base at risk, as they also needed to be picked up before the onset of winter. In early November, the winds were still stronger than many would have liked, but Mawson could not delay starting the expeditions any further if everything they planned to do was to be accomplished. Ninnis wrote in his diary, quote, "Mawson says no matter what the weather, the main parties start, and let the winds of hell do their worst." On November 7th, 1912, Mertz made everyone penguin egg omelettes for breakfast, after which the main expedition groups set off from the hut.